Summary report of the Wehrmacht High Command on the operations in Denmark and Norway from June 13, 1940. After the victorious conclusion of the battles for Narvik, the Wehrmacht High Command announces the following summary of the course of military operations in Denmark and Norway. The Allies' plans to turn the war in a favorable direction through Scandinavia had long been known to the Wehrmacht High Command and forced it to prepare a lightning-fast counterattack. Parts of the Army and Air Force, as well as the entire fleet, were therefore brought together to prepare for a unified action under the personal leadership of the Führer. After repeated flagrant violations of Norway's neutrality by British naval forces, an imminent coup by the English fleet triggered the operations at dawn on April 9th. They began by marching across the German-Danish border and landing in numerous ports and airports in Denmark and Norway. Their goal was to remove these two countries once and for all from the grasp of our enemies as a basis for a strategic encirclement from the north and for the economic strangulation of Germany. The securing of Denmark was carried out smoothly on April 9th thanks to the understanding attitude of the king and his government after brief skirmishes at the border. German troops landed in Norway on April 9th, both by ships and in airplanes, some of them passing the English naval forces in close proximity. Narvik, Trondheim, Bergen, Stavanger, Egersund, Kristiansand, Arendal, and Oslo were occupied. In Narvik, the resistance of Norwegian naval forces. In Trondheim, Kristiansand, and especially Oslo, the coastal defense had to be suppressed by the Navy, the Air Force, and landed Army shock troops. The heroic deeds that were accomplished by German leaders and their units, as well as by individual soldiers, will be reserved for later reporting. At its forefront will forever be the heroic fight and sinking of the cruiser Blücher. On April 21st, the bases gained were improved, secured, and expanded on all sides. The area around Oslo was pacified. The fortified Fredrikstad-Askim zone was in German hands. Kongsvinger was taken, and the land connection from Oslo via Kristiansand to Stavanger was established. Further north, the railway from Trondheim to the Swedish border and east of Narvik, the largest part of the Ore Railway, was in German control. After the British succeeded in sinking the coastal batteries intended to protect the port of Narvik, the invasion of the Ofoten Fjord by superior British naval forces could not be prevented. Our destroyers fell victim to them after a brave resistance, after they had fired their last shell and inflicted heavy losses on the enemy. The crews then joined as welcome reinforcements the small band of our mountain troops, who clung to the snow-covered rocky coast and defied the heavy fire of enemy ships' guns and all attempts to land in the following weeks. The fighting with parts of various Norwegian divisions in the high mountain valleys between Oslo and Bergen was still ongoing, and the necessary German reinforcements for the attack from the Oslo area towards Trondheim were only beginning to arrive when the Allies counterattacked. With the greatest use of naval forces and merchant ships, they threw troops ashore in Andalsnes, Namsos, and Harstad. Their intention was to revive the flagging Norwegian resistance, to retake Trondheim through a concentric attack from the north and south, to destroy the weak German battle group in the Narvik area, and, as the English orders found clearly show, to advance into the Swedish Ore area of Gällivare. This attempt met a miserable end everywhere. Initially, all of the enemy's efforts to challenge the German Air Force's control of the Norwegian area failed due to German fighter and anti-aircraft defenses, with heavy losses. Then young German regiments, excellently supported by the Luftwaffe, threw themselves at the Norwegian and English forces, which tried to prevent the unification of the German battle groups attacking from Oslo to the north and from Trondheim to the south. Under the most difficult terrain conditions, overcoming all the explosions and the destruction of bridges, the enemy was thrown from narrow to narrow in the mountain valleys, and by April 30th, already the German troops landed in Oslo, and Trondheim shook hands near Støren, 50 kilometers south of Trondheim. This meant that the British operational plans had failed. The English fled to Andalsnes, only to re-embark there under the loss-making attacks of the German Luftwaffe, abandoning large amounts of material and supplies. On May 2nd, our troops raised the German flag in Andalsnes. From Trondheim, a German detachment with the support of light naval forces had already taken the narrows of Steinkjer on April 25th and there stopped the enemy's advance from Namsos. With the reinforcements that had now arrived, the advance north continued immediately. But the British and French forces landed at Namsos no longer took up the fight. Under shameful circumstances, they abandoned the Norwegians and embarked. Only then did those bitterly lay down their weapons. On May 6th, Grong, Namsos, and Mosjøen were taken by our troops. From there, mountain troops fought their way with Norwegian and English battalions and the extremely difficult terrain to Fauske and Bodo, which were reached on June 1st, over 500 kilometers from Drontheim. This meant that the northernmost base was gained, from which the necessary help was to be brought to the beleaguered Narvik group on land over completely pathless and high alpine terrain. This had now been attacked from the sea, on both flanks and in the rear, by an almost six-fold superiority. English, French alpine fighters, Polish mountain riflemen, and strong parts of the Norwegian 6th Division tried to encircle and destroy the weak German forces. The coastal positions, and on May 28th, the town of Narvik, had to be abandoned. But in the mountains, on both sides of the Rombaken Fjord, and on the Ore Railway, the enemy could not break the resistance of these steely troops and the indomitable will of their exemplary leader. So they held out, supported solely by the Luftwaffe, only sparsely supplied with everything necessary, and supplemented and reinforced by detached mountain and paratroopers, repeatedly gaining air through counterattacks, until the German combat units from their airfields had advanced far to the north, and the losses of enemy war and merchant ships increased to unbearable levels. Only then did the enemy give up this last piece of Norwegian soil. German naval forces attacked his return march on June 8th and destroyed the aircraft carrier Glorious with its 2 accompanying destroyers and transport and merchant ships with a tonnage of almost 30,000 gross registered tons. On land, Narvik and Elvegardsmoen were reoccupied, and on June 10th, the surrender negotiations between the German High Command in Norway and the Norwegian High Command were signed. All remaining Norwegian forces laid down their arms. The campaign in Norway has since ended. Its special character is that of a Wehrmacht operation that, to a previously unknown extent, brought parts of the Army and the Air Force into tactical action with the Navy under unified leadership. The Navy has solved a task that previously seemed impossible. With daring use of ships and crews far from its own bases and almost under the eyes of the greatly superior British fleet, it carried out a landing operation, sometimes forced and sometimes surprising, in the ports protected by numerous heavy coastal batteries. With an enormous transport performance of around 2.3 million gross registered tons, it transferred the bulk of the German naval forces and their supplies to Norway in uninterrupted, dense sea traffic. This happened despite the ongoing flank threat from the vastly superior British fleet and the deployment of numerous enemy submarines. Supported by the larger units are torpedo boats, minesweepers, submarine hunters, and speedboats. Escort vehicles and outpost boats were particularly involved in the success of this mass transport in day and night duty and in close cooperation with coastal aviation units. The success is all the greater because the target ports, some of which are opposite the English coast, are known to the enemy, and the narrow waters of the Kattegat and the Skagerrak had to be passed. Merchant ship crews fulfilled their duty on weeks-long voyages with the same joyful willingness to sacrifice as the soldiers of the Navy. Light naval forces at various points near Drontheim and Bergen, but especially naval detachments disembarked near Narvik, took part in excellent fraternity in the Army's operations and battles. The vast expanse of the coast was heavily secured by batteries that had been taken over and newly added. The German Navy inflicted the following losses on the British and French fleets: an aircraft carrier, a cruiser, 10 destroyers, a submarine hunter, 19 submarines, totaling around 65,000 tons, as well as a transport ship and a tanker with a total of 29,100 gross registered tons. 11 Norwegian warships were also destroyed, 2 coastal armored ships, 3 destroyers, 7 mine layers, 2 minesweepers, 41 torpedo boats, and some submarines, as well as many smaller vessels were seized. The Air Force in Norway proved to be the decisive factor in the success of the operation. It bore the brunt of the fight against the enemy fleet, which was numerically far superior to our Navy, and it alone was able to bring supplies, reinforcements, and relief to the Narvik Group, which was fighting alone without any land or sea connections until June 10th. It has provided decisive proof for future developments that no fleet, no matter how powerful, can operate in the long term in the close range of a superior enemy air force. This way, the German Air Force managed to drive away the enemy naval forces that were stationed near the Norwegian coast after our landing. It inflicted enormous losses on enemy ship movements landing at Namsos and Andalsnes and transporting from there. The proudest success was the destruction of an English battleship on May 3rd in the Namsos Sea area. The rapid seizure of Oslo and Stavanger on April 9th was only possible through the use of paratroopers and airborne troops. Fighter and dive bombers shook the crews of the enemy's coastal batteries in the Oslo Fjord and Kristiansand and hastened their surrender. As always, the Luftwaffe also intervened effectively in the ground battles, for example between Oslo and Bergen, and especially between Oslo and Drontheim, interrupting the rear communications and disrupting supplies. Before the land connection between Oslo and Drontheim was established, it transferred many thousands of reinforcements to Drontheim. With its fighters and destroyers, it has dominated the airspace from day one and has not shied away from any difficulties, no matter how great, when it came to building new airfields. The fact that the heroic resistance of the Narvik Group ended with a complete victory is due, in addition to the great successes in the Western theater of war, to the use of the Air Force. The success of combat operations is also reflected in the enemy's losses. The following were destroyed: 87 enemy aircraft, excluding those on the British aircraft carriers, which were sunk in the Ofoten Fjord on May 25th and in the Norwegian Sea on June 8th, 28 war and auxiliary warships with around 90,000 tons, 71 merchant ships with around 280,000 gross registered tons. In addition, 80 war and auxiliary warships and 39 merchant ships were damaged by bombs. The Army's divisions, apart from the French and English forces, smashed, captured, forced to surrender, or threw across the Swedish border 6 Norwegian divisions. The Wehrmacht's own losses in terms of officers, non-commissioned officers, and men are fallen 1,317, wounded 1,604. On sea transport or otherwise missing, 2,375. The Kriegsmarine has 3 cruisers, 10 destroyers, 1 torpedo boat, 6 submarines, and around 15 smaller warships and auxiliary vessels lost. The Luftwaffe lost 90 aircraft during operations against the enemy and through forced landings at sea. 27 aircraft were damaged by forced landings over land and by enemy action on the ground.
Thank you for listening. Join us also for the subsequent Wehrmacht Blitzkrieg briefing about the campaign in the West. Subscribe to Major Antonio's channel. We'll get back to you next week. So long.